Well, thank you for having me speak to you today. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you about the missions, about Father Serra, about the Native American history here in California, which is very tragic. There's been a lot of controversy lately because of the removal of statues of Father Serra. So I want to also comment on that toward the end of the talk to give you an appreciation to answer why so many people ask why aren't the bishops saying something or more forceful or speaking out against the removal of statues, etc., and what's the thinking there. So those are the things I kind of want to talk about today. There was very little contact between the Native Americans in California and Europeans before the missions began in 1769. For example, there was Juan Cabrillo in 1542, briefly landed in California. Francis Drake, came into California in 1579, and Sebastiano Vizcaino in 1602. So that's a big gap from 1602 to 1769. When the Portola expedition entered California, no Native American had ever seen a European before that. So it was entirely new to them, this contact with Europeans, when Portola arrived. And in his expedition was Father Serra, who was the first missionary to enter into California, first one to encounter the Native Americans. In 1769, when they arrived, there are about 300,000 Native Americans that we estimate in California. Some people say as high as 1 million, but most historians are comfortable saying around 300,000. But 300,000 was enormous. It was the largest gathering of Native Americans in all of the United States was in California. Some 300 tribes, and the tribes were divided into smaller villages. So the whole of the state was dotted with these villages of Native Americans, and an estimated number of 300,000. Father Serra had a unique position, something that never happened in the other missions. He was sent with a twofold obligation to the Spanish government. One was to evangelize the natives, make them Christian, and the other was to, in the terms of the Spanish government, civilize them, which meant to make them citizens of Spain. And therefore they were to learn the European Spanish customs and traditions and way of life so that they could be full citizens of the Spanish Empire. And that didn't happen in other places. The missionaries were sent to Christianize people. But Serra had this other obligation which placed him with a responsibility to Spanish law, to enforce Spanish law in California as they began their missionary work. Now, Serra did not live that long. He only lived 15 years in California before he died. He did found, as they say, 9 missions, but founding the missions is a very broad term. The older missions, San Diego, Carmel, San Gabriel, which was the third mission he founded, they had progressed far enough that they were building permanent buildings. But the later missions that he founded still were in the level of living in huts, very much like the domiciles that the Native Americans built out of straw and branches, and making these mission buildings. So you almost say, well, it wasn't really like founding a mission like we know the missions today. He began them, so he's the founder of those missions. Over time, after him, more permanent buildings were built by the missionaries that succeeded him in California. Now, he was the father of the missions in the sense that he was the superior, and the missions that were founded during his time, he was responsible for all of them and for the operations of them. He loved the Native Americans very deeply. We know that from his writings. He suffered greatly when he felt they had been mistreated. And yet he was under this twofold obligation as a pastor to be sympathetic, merciful, and to Christianize them, but as a representative of the Spanish government to impose Spanish law. They didn't treat the Indians any different than they did the citizens of Spain. In Spain, if you violated the law, there was a punishment. The punishment usually involved being whipped for a number of stripes, depending on the law. If you stole something or violated the law in some way, there was a punishment. The same thing was applied in California. But Serra was very concerned anytime he heard that there was any excessive abuse of the Indians. He writes about that. So we know in his own writing that he was concerned. Twice that we know of, he sent Spanish missionary Franciscans back to Mexico because he thought they were too severe in dealing with the Indians. He had tremendous difficulties dealing with the soldiers. And that was very difficult for him because he was responsible for their behavior, but he couldn't control it. For a brief time, he was made the governor of California, but he asked that responsibility be removed because he just had no way of governing the soldiers. And one of the interesting things, as we know, is that he did not allow the presidios, where the soldiers lived, to be close to the missions. He wanted at least 5 miles separate to keep the soldiers as far away from the natives as possible. And so you see, like in Carmel, where you have the mission Carmel, is about 5 miles from the Presidio, which is in downtown Monterey today, which is where Serra himself lived most of the time when he wasn't walking to the other missions on visitations. In his lifetime, Serra converted very few natives, personally converted them, because he was very concerned that they really be well educated before they accepted baptism. After his time, it was not the same. Baptism was much more generally given than he was very strict about really wanting them to be sure that they truly believed before they became baptized. Because once they were baptized, they were considered to be citizens of Spain. And therefore they came under Spanish law, Spanish rule. If they violated the law, they had to receive the punishment that came from violating the law. And so you hear a lot of stories, many of them written down these days, about the treatment of the Indians during the mission period and after, mostly after, because the great genocide occurred after the mission period. But during the mission period, you know, there are stories that come down, and we know that Native American history was an oral history. They had an exact way of handing down exact verbally presented from one person to another. The storytellers who were in the villages had to memorize the stories exactly so that the history was, and we know from across the United States that very often when there's a difference between what the U.S. government or the soldiers said and what the Indians said, on closer examination, the Indian history tends to be far more accurate. Same way in California. So I never doubt a story told by a family about the native, something that happened at the mission or post-mission to their family. What I do doubt at times is universalizing it. You can hear a horrible story told of somebody being mistreated by a soldier, and I never doubt that happened, but that it happened generally or broadly, I don't think that's true. I don't think history would bear that to be true. But I never question the story itself. As I said, during Serra's time, there were about 300,000 Native Americans. Most of them never had any contact with the missions. The number of natives that had contact with the missions were the ones where the missions were built along the Pacific coast. The Indians living inland never had contact with the missionaries or the soldiers, yet in the long run they also suffered because of what happened. Now during the mission period, and the natives will bring this up, about half of the Native Americans in California died during the 65 years of the missions. About half, 150,000 died in that time period. Many of them never had any contact with the missions. But what happened was they were introduced to diseases that they had no immunity to. And when they were given permission to go from the mission to visit relatives or their villages, they carried those diseases with them. No one knew about, germ theory in those days. No one knew how diseases were communicated. And so people had the germs, just as we see today with COVID-19, and they unwittingly passed it on to someone else when they were home visiting. And those people who never saw a missionary died because of the disease brought by the soldiers and the missionaries into California. The other problem was that there were villages of people who literally died from starvation. And why? Because the missionaries had no understanding of how the natives cultivated the soil. California Indians were not farmers as we know farmers. They didn't, plow the fields and make even rows of vegetation. But they knew where the vegetation they could eat grew, and they carefully protected that. Their usual way of cultivation was at the end of the harvesting season to burn the land and allow the soot of the burned to enter into the soil so that the new that would come forward the next spring would bring forth what they ate. The missionaries, on the other hand, saw these verdant fields and thought they were wonderful places for the cattle, because the Indians had never seen cattle. The missionaries brought them, and the herds grew to thousands of cattle were being sent into these fields that actually were the food for the Indians living in the villages, especially the inland villages. And so a lot of their food production was destroyed. And because of that, there were periods of starvation where people died from starvation. It was never intended that that should happen. And literally, when you read the mission accounts, the missionaries didn't know why it was happening. Serra writes almost in tears that he couldn't understand why so many natives were dying. He didn't understand why they were getting sick, because they were caring for them as best they could. But not knowing germ theory as we know it today, they literally were counterproductive. For example, there was at San Juan Bautista Mission, there was an outbreak of smallpox. The Indians were dying from smallpox, so the missionaries thought the best thing to do was take the children from their parents and bring the children into the missions where they could protect them from the smallpox. So they brought all these children to live in the mission, and what happened was they all died from smallpox because they were living in close communication to one another. And the result was that all of these little children all died. There's a part of the cemetery at San Juan Bautista Mission where all these children were buried. The Indians remember that, and they say, well, it was because of the missionaries. And in fact, yes, it was because of the missionaries, but not because of any ill intent. I would say during the mission period, the missionaries, and especially Serra in his brief time, 15 years only out of 65 that he was there, 50 years the missions continued after he was gone. And things were not run perhaps as carefully in some cases after Serra's death as they were during his time. The problem is Serra was the first missionary, and the Indians remember that. He is the first one to bring this culture of Spain into California, to bring this Christian religion, etc. And so even though Serra himself was a good man, the church has canonized him as a saint, a compassionate man. From his writings, we know his deep concern for the natives. From the response of the natives when he died, the great sorrow was expressed by the ones who knew him, demonstrate that he was, in fact, a very good missionary. But at the same time, he was the first one to arrive, and he becomes, I use the term, in some cases, he's like the poster boy for European culture. And that's what the natives remember. And so many of them, especially the non-Catholic natives, see Serra as not a good figure, but rather as the symbolism of oppression for their culture. After the mission period, which it ended, the missionary period ended with the secularization of the missions in 1834. After that time period begins the Great Genocide in California, which is really tragic. And this is what people need to realize, because this gets simply grouped together with the mission period. And it was such an oppressive time period for the Indians that they really have a very strong case for saying that there was literally a genocide. In fact, a book I recommend that came out a couple of years ago by Benjamin Madley is called An American Genocide. This is the most authentic, authoritative book, The United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, which literally was a genocide. There was no genocide among the missionaries. To have a genocide, you have to intend to kill off a group of people. There was never any intention among the missionaries. After the mission period, there was very definitely intention to kill off the Indians in California. What happened was in 1834, Mexico threw Spain out from control, and the missions were taken over by Mexico, and they were secularized, which meant all of the Spaniards who were missionaries were excluded and sent back to Spain. Only the Franciscans who were missionaries, who were Mexicans, were allowed to stay, but they were not allowed to stay at the missions. So they established separate sites, buildings, small buildings, church sites. The missions buildings themselves were sold off, oftentimes to large land holders. And the land, which originally under Spanish law was intended to be given to the Indians, Mexico now divided between the Indians and these large ranchos that they established, like Pio Pico's huge land holdings and other famous people in California history. Spanish rule was intended this way. They would be Christianized and civilized, and when they were ready, they would be given the land, and all of California was to be given to the Indians. It was their land. That's how Spain understood it. Mexico changed it. The Mexican government said, no, the land belongs to Mexico. We will take care of the Indians by giving them some land, and they established these huge ranchos of people who were loyal to the Mexican government, became these huge ranch owners. What happened was a lot of this land that was given to the landowners had Indian villages on it. So they wanted them out, excluded. And so they attempted to drive them off the land. If they wouldn't leave, very often at night they would send out their raiders to kill them. And village by village, they were eliminating the Indians from their property. And it was not considered illegal. Nobody was arrested for doing it. The Indians had reduced then amount of land that was available to them. The Mexican period is going to end in 1848. So it's a short period, 1821 to 1848. But in that period of time, about another 50,000 Indians were killed. And then we had probably only about 100,000 Indians in California by the end of the Mexican period. Then came the worst period. 1848 came the California Republic, and within less than a year, California became part of the United States. Not yet, it was a territory, and in 1850 it became a state. 1848 began the removal of the Indians from California. We have to remember that in 1849, what happened was the gold rush, Sutter's Mill, and European people from the United States and from Europe in great numbers entered California to find gold. So the territory of California was suddenly expanding with all these people. By the time it became a state in 1850, the gold rush literally was over. What gold there was gone, had been discovered, and all these people were now living in California. And what could they do? Many of them were farmers, so they wanted to go back to farming. But the farmland was owned by the Indians. So there was only two ways to get that land. And the government of California as a state approved it. One approach was to force them off the land, swindle them, might give them some money, very much less than the land was worth, and force them to move. Or in the other case, if the land was abandoned, and how better for it to be abandoned than for the native to be killed, especially at night, to disappear. The landowner is gone, so then somebody comes in and starts farming the land. So very rapidly, the Indians are losing their property and are being reduced in numbers. The first three governors of California, the first three, I think the first one was named Bartlett, they all made the statement at their inaugurations that California will never be fully a state unless the Indians are exterminated. Exterminated was the word they used, killed off. And so there was bounties placed on Indian heads. Or if an Indian was in town on a Saturday night and got drunk, then he was placed in jail. His land was taken away from him. And then he very often was sold by the government to some ranch owner as a slave. California had slavery, legal slavery, under the Constitution of California when it became a state, well, first a territory in 1849 and then a state in 1850. Slavery lasted in California until 1875, even though it had been eliminated throughout the United States by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. California still had Indian slavery. You could go downtown Los Angeles, Elvira Street, on a Monday morning and buy an Indian if you needed an Indian. Could be an Indian child, because the government might say, this family is not capable of raising the child, so we take them away from the family, and then they would sell the children as servants to some ranch owner. Slavery continued in this state till 1875 in the state of California. It was legal in California. But as I said, the newspapers in California ran weekly lists of the numbers of Indian skulls originally and later scalps that were brought back as proof that they were dead. So they would have a counting of 200 were brought back. Posses were organized by the governors of California to go out and kill Indians, okay? And it didn't matter if the Indians had done any violation of the law, but if there had been any violation, they saw that as a reason to go out and kill any Indian they found. So legitimately what happened in those years is that we had another reduction of California Indians, to the fact that when the first census of California was taken in the year 1910, they could only find a total of 16,371 Indians in the state of California. So in that time period, we had gone from 300,000 to 16,371. But half of them were killed off during the Genocide period, which was the end of the mission period, 1834 until 1910. We have only 18,000 plus Indians left in the state of California. truly was a genocide. It was intentional. It was intended in order to get the land, which belonged to the Indians, and to make that a California territory, make it part of the state of California. So the Indians have a very tragic history in the state of California. When we began the process for the canonization of Father Serra a few years back, there was a lot of opposition, and this goes back more than 20 years. When the beatification process started under Bishop Schubsta and in Monterey, there was a large outcry of the Native Americans against Father Serra being beatified in the church. So much so that when Pope John Paul II visited here, the original intent was he would beatify Serra when he was at Mission San Carlos Borromeo during that visit, but instead they chose to hold off from that and not beatify him here in the state because of the outcry of the natives. When he was canonized, as you know, just a couple years ago, the canonization ceremony occurred in Washington, D.C., not in California. Pope Francis did the canonization during his visit to the United States. Why was that? Because there was just a huge opposition in California by Native Americans that he should be recognized as a saint. And it wasn't because they necessarily saw him as an evil man. Some of them did. But it's because he was seen as the symbol of the oppression of the Indians. And that symbol that he had became very offensive, even to very devout Catholic Indians here in California. So when we were moving toward the canonization announced by the Pope, we began a process of meeting with the Native Americans. And the committee that I chair in the state was established at that time, our committee for Native Americans. And we pledged as the bishops of California to the Indians that we were going to do a certain number of things. Number one, that we would help tell the true story of the Indian genocide in California. And that means we were going to be true to our understanding of Serra, but also true to our understanding of this oppressive, terrible genocide period. Tell the whole story. It also meant that we had to do something about what was being taught in our schools. California law requires that in the 3rd and 4th grade, we teach the children in California the history of the Indians and the history of the missions. The problem was what was being taught was only in the mission period. So the genocide was not being taught, and therefore people who knew the genocide began to associate it with the mission period, even though it really wasn't the mission period. We have to be truthful. A lot of Indians died because of starvation and disease, unintentionally, half of them in the mission period. The other half died because of genuine genocide, oppressive attempt, willing attempt to eradicate the Indians in California. So that history had to be told. And so our first obligation was we put together educators and we wrote the education in our Catholic schools. And there's also going to be a segment for the 11th grade in our Catholic high schools dealing with this, to tell the true story of the missions and of the Native Americans to our children. The curriculum was rewritten. We worked with St. Mary's Press in doing a fabulous system that was piloted last year very successfully, and this year, for the first time, is being used in every Catholic school, elementary school in the state of California. That was our first commitment to the Indians. The second commitment to the Indians was that we were going to do something about the missions. Most of our missions do not tell the story of the Indians. If there's any display on them, it's very limited, and a lot of it is not factual. Every mission was built by a different group of Indians, the local tribes. They didn't have the same history. They didn't have the same culture. They were different. So we said that we would rework our missions the the museums, and then what the docents tell people when they do tours of the missions. That so mission by mission, we're doing an evaluation of what's there, and then giving guidelines for upgrading it to be a more accurate display of the history of the mission. Most of our missions had a peaceful relationship with the Indians, but not all of them. San Diego and San Gabriel, for example, had uprisings of the mission of the Indians. The Indians were not as peaceful as the Chumash were. Father Serra loved working with the Chumash because they were so cooperative, and actually built the largest number of missions in the Chumash area, from Carmel all the way to Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, San Juan Bautista, San Buenaventura. Those are all Chumash missions. Very peaceful missions, but not so in some of the others. We need to tell that story too. Why did they rise up? What was the result of their rising up, etc. And so we told them we will do that. Our third commitment to the Indians is that we would do something to make sure that the cemeteries and the mission properties were available to them. They're the ones, their families built it. The Indians, even though they might have found the mission period oppressive, loved the missions because their families built them. They're very loyal to the mission buildings because their families built them. There was no one more upset by the burning of San Gabriel Mission this past year than was the local tribe. The chief there, is a very close friend of mine, was very upset by what happened. He was in tears when the mission was set on fire, because he said the souls of our ancestors are in the walls of the mission because it was their sweat that built those walls. Their spirit lives on in the walls. And so they have this sense that the missions are sacred to them, even if they have a problem with some of the history of the missions. And so they're very, very careful about that. That brings me to the point then about the statues of Father Serra. Because the Native Americans, I think not rightly understood, but nonetheless, see Serra as a symbol of oppression. And again, not a person of oppression, but a symbol of oppression, because he was the first missionary. He's been lauded as the father of California, the state, and the father of the missions. He's become a symbol, and that symbol has been a very difficult one for the natives. It's been as difficult for them as for the African Americans to see in the South tributes to the enslavers, to those who fought against the Union during the Civil War. To live every day seeing these statues that were oppressive to their people is what they see as the problem with Father Serra, as they do with statues of Lee, for example, in the black African Americans in the South. You know, to go by a plaza every day on your way to work or to school and see this statue praising someone who they considered a symbol of oppression was very difficult for them. So when they began asking this year for the removal of statues of Serra from public land, we as the bishops of California said we can support that. From public land, the statues could be taken down because it's difficult for them to see it. But we stood against removing them from the mission grounds because that's a very different category. And so that's where we stand, and I think that's important for people to realize. So when they wanted the statue of Father Serra removed from the plaza, the public park across the street from Mission San Fernando, we didn't object to that. In fact, Monsignor Weber, the curator of the mission, took custody of the statue for its safekeeping, and they took the statue down and it's currently in storage at the San Fernando Mission. It'll find a home somewhere on church property. On the other hand, when they wanted the statue of Father Serra removed from Santa Ynez Mission, which is on church ground, we said no. No, that's church property, and the statue of Father Serra will stay. And so we've held our ground on that. It was very distressing when they tore down the statue of Father Serra in Los Angeles Plaza, downtown. But we also know that the natives that did that were not California natives. The group that did that was a kind of a radical group of Indian rights group, mostly Central Americans. Our California natives were not involved in tearing down that statue. The statue, and the same in the statue at the Capitol building in Sacramento, those were not our California natives. There might have been a few radicalized ones, but by and large they were not. They were, identifiable people. And several of the missions where the statue was out in front of the mission, like San Gabriel, we removed it and put it inside of the mission grounds itself of Father Serra, simply because we didn't see a reason to poke people in the eye. Every day they go by the statue. If it's painful to them, why would we want to continue being painful to them? We want to honor Serra, and we will honor Serra. But at the same time, we understand the pain of our Native American people. We've grown closer to them in recent years. Very often, to be honest, the most neglected Catholics in our entire church have been our Native American Catholics throughout the United States. And I think the church is renewing its commitment of service to our Native Americans. We have a vibrant Native American ministry in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. We're very thankful and grateful for them. We have one of the largest groups of urban Indians in the entire country in Los Angeles, and we're proud of our ministry to them. We want to work with them. We don't want to do anything that offends them. At the same time, we want them to develop their consciousness of their faith and of the singular gift that God gave us in California with the missions. As a good friend of mine says, that every day she thanks God for Father Serra bringing the gift of Christianity, and she feels sad about Father Serra for bringing the civilization of Spain. So it's she says she has very mixed feelings, but she says, I love my faith, and that is a great gift that Father Serra brought to my family. So I think that that kind of, I think, hopefully helps us to understand the tragic history of the genocide of the Native Americans in California, a true genocide, because it was willfully intended to get them off the property so they could give it to other people. And the laws that California established were laws to disenfranchise the original holders of the land. It's a sad history. Every day we walk on land that was stolen. Every day in California, this land belonged to somebody else till it was taken away from them. And so we've built a civilization on land that our predecessors stole across the United States. When you read the history of what took place, beginning with George Washington, and Washington segregated the Indians to protect the Indians. By the time you got to Andrew Jackson, it was to segregate the Indians in order to take their land from them. And you begin the Trail of Tears, and the whole history of Indians in California from Andrew Jackson on is a very tragic history in California, in the United States, but most tragic in California, because here in this state, probably a third of all of the Native Americans in the whole country lived here in California, and the way we treated them was tragic. Great. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm sorry we can't have a question and answer period, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions that have come to your mind. But I really do recommend, if you're a reader, this book is an incredible book. An American Genocide is the book. Benjamin Madley is the writer. Just been out about 2 years. It's a great book.